The mop squeaked rhythmically against the polished floor of Fort Braxton's main barracks, echoing through the empty corridor like a metronome marking time. Marcus Thompson moved with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands guiding the cleaning equipment with the same precision he once used for far deadlier tools. At 45, his graying temples and slight stoop made him nearly invisible to the young soldiers who hurried past, their boots creating fresh scuff marks he'd clean again tomorrow. "Morning, Marcus," called out Private Jenkins, barely glancing up from his phone as he rushed toward the mess hall. It was the same greeting Marcus received every day, polite but dismissive, the kind reserved for background fixtures like water fountains or exit signs. Marcus nodded silently, watching the 19-year-old disappear around the corner. 5 years he'd been working at Fort Braxton, 5 years of blending into the institutional green walls and fluorescent lighting. The young soldiers saw only what they expected to see, a middle-aged janitor with calloused hands and a slight limp, someone who'd probably never held anything more dangerous than a cleaning supply. They weren't entirely wrong. These days, the heaviest thing Marcus lifted was an industrial vacuum cleaner, but the calluses on his hands told a different story, one of rappelling ropes and rifle grips, of nights spent crawling through hostile terrain where silence meant survival. The limp in his left leg came not from age, but from shrapnel that had torn through his thigh during his final deployment in Kandahar province. The morning sun streamed through the barracks windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny ghosts of memory. Marcus paused his cleaning, watching them swirl and settle. Sometimes, in moments like these, he could almost feel the weight of his old tactical gear, could almost smell the dust and cordite of Afghanistan's mountains. But then a door would slam, or a drill sergeant would shout orders in the distance, and he'd remember where he was, safe, stationary, invisible. His supervisor, Mrs. Chen, appeared at the end of the hallway, clipboard in hand, and her usual expression of mild concern creasing her features. She was one of the few people on base who treated Marcus as more than furniture, though even she didn't know his full story. "Marcus, honey, you doing all right this morning?" she asked, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd managed cleaning crews for over 2 decades. "You've been working that same spot for 5 minutes now." He looked down, realizing he'd been scrubbing the already spotless floor in small, repetitive circles. "Sorry, Mrs. Chen. Mind wandered a bit. No harm done. Just making sure you're with us today." She made a note on her clipboard. "We've got that big inspection coming up next week. General Harrison's visiting from Pentagon wants to see the whole operation." Marcus's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the mop handle. General Patricia Harrison. He'd heard the name before, back when names like that mattered in his world. Back when he was Staff Sergeant Thompson, 3rd Special Forces Group, when his opinions on strategy and tactics carried weight in briefing rooms filled with maps and classified intelligence. "I'll make sure everything's spotless," he said, his voice carrying none of the authority it once held when coordinating night raids and extraction missions. Mrs. Chen smiled and patted his shoulder with motherly affection. "I know you will, honey. You always do good work. Consistent, reliable, that's worth its weight in gold around here." As she walked away, Marcus resumed his cleaning with mechanical precision. Consistent and reliable. Once those words had been carved into commendation letters and performance reviews that spoke of courage under fire and decisive leadership. Now they described his ability to maintain clean floors and empty trash cans without complaint. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd traded a world where split-second decisions could mean life or death for one where the biggest crisis was running out of toilet paper in the enlisted men's bathroom. It should have felt like failure, but mostly it felt like relief. The nightmares came less frequently now, and his hands rarely shook anymore when unexpected sounds echoed through the hallways. A group of new recruits rounded the corner, fresh-faced and eager, their uniforms still carrying crisp creases from the supply room. They moved with the awkward energy of young men trying to project confidence they didn't yet possess. Marcus stepped aside, pressing his back against the wall to let them pass. "Thanks," one of them mumbled, not meeting his eyes. Marcus watched them go, remembering when he'd been that young, that certain the world was black and white, good and evil clearly defined. Before he'd learned that real combat was mostly grey areas and impossible choices, before he'd discovered that coming home could sometimes be harder than staying in the fight. His shift would end in 6 hours. He'd go home to his small apartment, heat up a frozen dinner, and watch the news with the sound turned low. Tomorrow he'd return, invisible and unnoticed, to clean up after young warriors who were still learning what it meant to serve. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen. Safe, predictable, and mercifully free from the weight of command decisions that kept him awake at night. At least that's what he told himself, as he pushed his cart toward the next section of hallway, the wheels squeaking a familiar rhythm against the polished floor. The bass buzzer echoed across Fort Braxton at precisely 0800 hours, signaling the start of what everyone knew would be an unusual day. General Patricia Harrison had arrived at dawn, her convoy of black SUVs cutting through the morning mist like shadows. Word traveled fast in military installations, and by the time Marcus began his morning rounds, the entire base was buzzing with nervous energy. Marcus pushed his cleaning cart past the main assembly area, where hundreds of soldiers were gathering in formation. Their voices created a low hum of anticipation, mixed with anxiety. He'd seen this before, the way bases transformed when high-ranking officials visited, how everyone suddenly stood a little straighter and spoke a little quieter. "Did you hear?" Private Martinez whispered to his companion as they hurried past Marcus toward the formation. "The general's looking for volunteers for some kind of demonstration. Rodriguez is involved." Staff Sergeant Diego Rodriguez. The name made Marcus pause in his cleaning. At 32, Rodriguez was Fort Braxton's most feared drill instructor, a mountain of muscle and military precision who could make seasoned soldiers tremble with a single glance. The man stood 6'4" and had earned his reputation through a combination of unwavering discipline and an intimidating physical presence that had never been successfully challenged. Marcus had observed Rodriguez from a distance over the years, watching him transform nervous civilians into disciplined soldiers through a careful mixture of psychological pressure and physical demands. The drill sergeant commanded respect through sheer force of personality, his voice capable of carrying across entire parade grounds, and his presence enough to straighten spines from 50 yards away. "Move along, janitor," came a sharp voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Lieutenant Parker, a young officer whose authority was still fresh enough to require constant demonstration. "This area's restricted during the general's visit." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, maneuvering his cart away from the gathering crowd. But instead of leaving entirely, he positioned himself near a maintenance alcove where he could observe while appearing to work. General Harrison took the podium with the commanding presence that had earned her 3 stars and a reputation as one of the Pentagon's most effective leaders. Even from a distance, Marcus could see why she'd risen through the ranks. Her posture radiated authority, and her voice carried clearly across the assembly area without need for amplification. "Soldiers," she began, her tone carrying the weight of decades in service, "I've come to Fort Braxton today because this installation has a reputation for producing some of our finest warriors, but reputation must be backed by substance, and substance must be tested." The crowd fell silent. Hundreds of young faces focused on the woman who held their careers in her hands. Marcus found himself listening intently, his cleaning forgotten as something deep in his military training responded to the general's presence. "I'm looking for a volunteer," Harrison continued, "someone willing to demonstrate the fighting spirit that has made American forces respected worldwide. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has graciously agreed to participate in a demonstration of combat readiness and tactical thinking." Marcus watched Rodriguez step forward, his massive frame seeming to expand as he assumed a position of attention. The drill sergeant's reputation was built on more than just intimidation. He was genuinely skilled, with certifications in multiple combat disciplines and a service record that included deployments in 3 different theaters of operation. "The volunteer will engage Staff Sergeant Rodriguez in a non-lethal combat exercise," the general explained. "Hand-to-hand combat, tactical thinking, and adaptability under pressure. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about demonstrating the courage to step forward when your country calls regardless of the odds." A murmur rippled through the assembled soldiers. Marcus could see the conflict in their faces, the desire to impress the general, warring with the very real concern about facing Rodriguez in any kind of physical confrontation. The drill sergeant wasn't just big, he was trained, experienced, and had never been bested in the informal challenges that occasionally arose on base. "I know what you're thinking," Harrison continued with a slight smile. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is an imposing figure. But remember, in real combat, you don't get to choose your opponents. Sometimes David faces Goliath, and sometimes the underdog surprises everyone." Minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. Marcus could see soldiers glancing at each other, each hoping someone else would step forward. A few of the larger, more confident recruits shifted their weight, clearly considering their chances, but none moved from formation. Lieutenant Parker, standing near the front, looked like he might volunteer before thinking better of it. Even some of the more seasoned NCOs seemed reluctant to face Rodriguez, who stood motionless as a statue, his expression unreadable but intimidating. Marcus felt something stirring inside him, a familiar sensation he hadn't experienced in years. It was the same feeling that had once made him volunteer for the most dangerous missions, the same instinct that had driven him to lead from the front when other soldiers looked to him for guidance. His hands, steady now on the cart handle, remembered a different kind of grip. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. General Harrison's expression remained neutral, but Marcus could detect the slight disappointment creeping into her posture. This wasn't the response she'd hoped for from Fort Braxton's finest. "Anyone?" she asked again, her voice carrying a note of challenge. "Remember, this isn't about physical size or conventional strength. It's about heart, tactics, and the willingness to stand up when others hesitate." That's when Marcus did something he hadn't done in 5 years, something that surprised him as much as anyone else watching. He stepped out from behind his cleaning cart, raised his right hand, and spoke in a voice that carried across the assembly area with unexpected authority. "I volunteer, General." The silence that followed was deafening. Hundreds of heads turned in unison, expressions ranging from shock to confusion to outright disbelief. The unassuming janitor they'd all ignored for years was volunteering to face the most intimidating soldier on base. General Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly as she looked at Marcus, taking in his civilian work clothes, his graying hair, and his weathered appearance. Rodriguez turned as well, his intimidating scowl shifting to what might have been amusement. "And you are?" the general asked, her professional tone masking what Marcus suspected was considerable surprise. "Marcus Thompson, ma'am," he replied, unconsciously straightening into a posture that hadn't seen use in half a decade. "Base maintenance crew." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was no longer just curious. It was incredulous. Someone in the back actually laughed, quickly stifled by the solemnity of the moment. The laughter died quickly as General Harrison studied Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent decades evaluating soldiers. Something in his posture, the way he held himself despite the janitor's uniform, caught her attention. She'd seen enough combat veterans to recognize certain tells: the unconscious way he positioned his feet, the alert stillness that came from years of training, the respectful but unflinching eye contact. "Mr. Thompson," she said carefully, "I appreciate your willingness to volunteer, but this demonstration requires a certain level of physical conditioning and combat training. Are you sure you understand what you're volunteering for?" Marcus felt the weight of hundreds of stares, heard the whispered comments rippling through the formation. He could back down now, return to his cart and his invisible existence. It would be easy, expected even. But something in the general's tone, not dismissive, but genuinely concerned, triggered memories he'd spent 5 years trying to suppress. "Ma'am, I understand completely," he replied, his voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even him. "I'm willing to demonstrate whatever the Army needs demonstrated." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Marcus. Up close, the size difference was even more dramatic. Rodriguez had at least 6 inches and 60 pounds of muscle on the maintenance worker. But instead of the expected mockery, Rodriguez's expression showed professional curiosity. "Sir," Rodriguez addressed the general while keeping his eyes on Marcus, "if the volunteer is serious, I'm prepared to proceed, though I recommend we establish some ground rules to prevent unnecessary injury." The way he said it wasn't cruel, just pragmatic. Rodriguez was a professional who understood his own capabilities and the apparent mismatch before him. But there was something else in his tone, a note of respect for Marcus's willingness to step forward when no one else would. General Harrison nodded slowly. "Very well. We'll conduct this as a controlled demonstration. Non-lethal force only. Contest ends when one participant yields or is unable to continue." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, you have 5 minutes to prepare. Are you certain about this?" "Yes, ma'am." As the crowd began to form a wide circle around the designated area, Marcus walked back to his cleaning cart. His hands moved automatically, removing his work gloves and setting aside his janitor's cap. But his mind was elsewhere, traveling back through years to a dusty compound in Afghanistan where similar circles had formed around different kinds of contests. "Marcus, honey, what are you doing?" Mrs. Chen appeared beside him, her face creased with worry. "This is crazy. That Rodriguez fellow could hurt you seriously." "I'll be fine, Mrs. Chen," Marcus replied, surprised by how calm he felt. The nervous energy that had plagued him for years seemed to be settling into something more familiar, pre-mission focus. "But why?" she pressed. "You don't have anything to prove to these people." Marcus paused in his preparations, considering her question. Why was he doing this? Part of it was the challenge in the general's voice, the disappointment when no one else stepped forward. But there was something deeper, a stirring of the man he used to be, the soldier who'd never backed down from impossible odds. "Maybe I do," he said quietly, removing his work shirt to reveal a plain white t-shirt underneath. As he did, Mrs. Chen gasped softly. Marcus's arms, hidden beneath his work clothes, still carried the lean muscle definition of someone who'd maintained his physical conditioning even if he no longer advertised it. More telling were the scars, a patchwork of old wounds that spoke of violence survived and battles fought in places most people couldn't find on a map. The crowd grew quiet as Marcus walked back to the center of the circle. Rodriguez was already there, having removed his dress uniform jacket to reveal the imposing physique that had intimidated countless recruits. He was stretching methodically, his movements displaying the fluid power of an athlete in his prime. "Gentlemen," General Harrison called out, "this is a demonstration of military bearing, tactical thinking, and adaptive response. Remember, we're looking for heart as much as skill." Marcus found himself settling into a combat stance he hadn't used in half a decade, his body remembering movements drilled into muscle memory through years of training. The familiar weight distribution, the slight bend in his knees, the positioning of his hands, it all came back with startling clarity. Rodriguez noticed the change immediately. His casual confidence shifted to professional wariness as he recognized that the man across from him moved like someone with serious training. The drill sergeant's stance adjusted subtly, acknowledging that this might not be the mismatch everyone expected. "Ready?" the general called. Both men nodded. "Begin." Rodriguez moved first, coming forward with the measured aggression of someone confident in his superior size and strength. It was a good strategy against most opponents. Use overwhelming force to end things quickly before technique could compensate for physical disadvantages. But Marcus wasn't most opponents. As Rodriguez closed the distance, Marcus shifted almost imperceptibly to his left, his movement so subtle that most of the watching soldiers missed it entirely. Rodriguez's initial grab caught empty air as Marcus flowed around the larger man's attack like water around a stone. The crowd murmured in surprise, but Marcus was already moving, his body responding to reflexes honed in life-or-death situations where hesitation meant death. He didn't try to match Rodriguez's strength. Instead, he used the drill sergeant's momentum against him, guiding the larger man's charge past his target with a redirecting motion that looked almost effortless. Rodriguez recovered quickly, his training evident as he spun to face Marcus again. But now there was respect in his eyes, the recognition of one professional acknowledging another. The casual confidence was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of someone who realized he was in a real fight. "Interesting," Rodriguez muttered, circling now instead of charging. "Where did you learn to move like that, janitor?" Marcus didn't respond verbally, but his positioning answered for him. His stance had evolved from the basic combat-ready position to something more fluid, more dangerous. Those with combat experience in the crowd began to lean forward, recognizing movements that spoke of advanced training and real-world application. General Harrison watched with increasing interest, her practiced eye cataloging details that the younger soldiers missed. The way Marcus controlled distance, his economy of movement, the calm alertness in his posture, these weren't the actions of a civilian who'd taken a few self-defense classes. Rodriguez attacked again, this time with a series of quick strikes designed to test Marcus's defenses. He was fast for a big man, his fists moving with the precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting his technique. But Marcus was faster, deflecting each strike with minimal movement, never where Rodriguez expected him to be. The crowd was completely silent now, the earlier whispers and comments dying as they watched something none of them had anticipated. The unassuming janitor they'd ignored for years was not just holding his own against Fort Braxton's most feared drill instructor, he was controlling the pace of the encounter. "Enough testing," Rodriguez growled, launching into a more serious assault. His training took over, combinations flowing together with practiced skill as he tried to overwhelm Marcus through sheer aggression and superior reach. But Marcus had fought bigger, stronger opponents in places where losing meant more than embarrassment. His responses became more decisive, more aggressive. A deflection turned into a counter-strike that caught Rodriguez in the ribs. A dodge became a takedown attempt that nearly brought the larger man to the ground. The transformation was visible to anyone watching closely. The stooped janitor was gone, replaced by someone who moved with the fluid precision of a predator. Marcus's breathing remained controlled, his movements economical and purposeful. This wasn't luck or desperation, this was skill, maintained and refined over years of combat experience. Rodriguez grunted as one of Marcus's strikes found its mark, a precise shot to his solar plexus that momentarily disrupted his breathing. The drill sergeant stepped back, reassessing his opponent with new eyes. "Who are you?" Rodriguez asked, his question carrying beyond the immediate tactical situation to something deeper. Marcus paused, his stance relaxing slightly. For a moment, the question seemed to hang in the air, carrying weight that went beyond the physical contest taking place. Who was he? The invisible janitor who'd spent 5 years hiding from his past? Or the soldier who'd once led men into impossible situations and brought them home alive? "Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson," he said quietly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as anyone else. 3rd Special Forces Group Airborne, retired. The silence that followed was different from before. Now it carried the weight of recognition, of understanding. Special Forces, Green Berets. The soldiers in the crowd looked at Marcus with new eyes, seeing past the maintenance uniform to the warrior beneath. General Harrison stepped forward, her expression revealing that she was putting pieces together in her mind. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," she said slowly, "would that be the same Marcus Thompson who led the rescue operation at Firebase Charlie in 2019? Marcus met her gaze directly for the first time, his shoulders straightening as years of carefully maintained anonymity fell away. "Yes, ma'am." The murmur that went through the crowd now carried a different tone entirely. Firebase Charlie had been national news, a small outpost overrun by enemy forces, its garrison trapped and facing annihilation until a special forces team had fought their way in against impossible odds to extract the survivors. Rodriguez lowered his hands completely, his aggressive posture shifting to something approaching reverence. "Sir, I read about that operation in training. You saved 37 soldiers that night." 38, Marcus corrected quietly. "We don't leave people behind." The words carried the weight of absolute conviction, the kind of certainty that came from living by a code that transcended personal safety or comfort. In that moment, every person in the circle understood they were looking at someone whose service had cost him in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a distant battlefield. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood motionless, his combat stance completely abandoned, as the magnitude of who he'd been fighting became clear. Around the circle, young soldiers who moments before had been placing bets on how quickly their drill instructor would end the fight, now stared at Marcus with a mixture of awe and disbelief. General Harrison stepped closer to the center of the circle, her expression shifting from professional interest to something approaching reverence. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, your file indicated you retired due to medical reasons. I was told you'd left the service entirely." Marcus felt the familiar weight settling on his chest, the burden of explaining why a decorated Special Forces operator was pushing a mop instead of training the next generation of warriors. His hands, steady throughout the confrontation with Rodriguez, began to show the slightest tremor. "Yes, ma'am. Medical discharge. PTSD primarily, with some physical complications from my final deployment." His voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who'd given this explanation before, to VA doctors and disability reviewers and well-meaning civilians who couldn't understand why a war hero would choose invisibility over recognition. Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier aggression replaced by genuine respect. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to continue the demonstration. But as a learning exercise, not a contest, these soldiers could benefit from seeing real combat technique in action." Marcus looked around the circle of faces, seeing them truly for the first time in 5 years. They weren't just obstacles to clean around or voices to ignore. They were soldiers, young men and women who might someday face the same impossible situations he'd survived, the same situations some of his teammates hadn't. "I don't know if that's appropriate," Marcus began, but General Harrison raised a hand to stop him. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, with respect, you volunteered for this demonstration. These soldiers have never seen combat-tested techniques applied by someone with your experience. If you're willing, I believe this could be valuable training." The weight of command settled on Marcus's shoulders like an old, familiar coat. How many times had he stood before groups of soldiers, sharing hard-won knowledge that might keep them alive, in situations where theory met deadly reality? The muscle memory of leadership stirred, responding to the expectant faces around him. "All right," he said, his voice carrying more authority than it had in years, "but we do this properly. Rodriguez, you're going to attack me with intent, not to harm, but to win. Everyone else, watch the fundamentals. Combat isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being smarter, adapting faster and never giving up." Rodriguez nodded, resuming his combat stance with renewed focus. But now his attacks came with explanation, Marcus calling out techniques and principles as they moved. "Distance management," Marcus said as he sidestepped Rodriguez's charge. "Don't be where your opponent expects you to be. Rodriguez is bigger and stronger, so I don't meet force with force. I redirect it." He demonstrated, using Rodriguez's momentum to throw the larger man off balance. Rodriguez rolled with the motion, coming to his feet quickly, but Marcus was already explaining the next principle. Recovery time. Rodriguez just showed you good defensive reaction. He didn't stay down, didn't let the setback become defeat. In real combat, hesitation kills. The demonstration continued, but it had transformed from a contest into a masterclass. Marcus moved with fluid precision, each technique chosen for educational value as much as tactical effectiveness. He showed how to turn an opponent's strength into weakness, how to create opportunities from apparent disadvantages, how to maintain composure under pressure. The young soldiers watched in fascination, seeing principles they'd learned in training applied with the kind of instinctive mastery that only came from years of real-world application. This wasn't theoretical combat. This was knowledge earned in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. Situational awareness, Marcus continued, demonstrating how to track multiple threats while engaged with one opponent. "Rodriguez isn't my only concern right now. I'm tracking wind direction, ground conditions, potential weapons, escape routes. Combat is chess, not checkers." Private Martinez, the same young soldier who'd hurried past Marcus that morning without a second glance, found himself taking mental notes as if his life depended on it. The transformation in his perception was complete. The invisible janitor had become a source of potentially life-saving knowledge. General Harrison observed with professional appreciation, recognizing the quality of instruction taking place. This wasn't just combat demonstration. It was the kind of advanced tactical education usually reserved for special operations units, being delivered with the clarity that came from someone who'd not only studied these techniques, but survived by applying them. "Final principle," Marcus said, stepping back from Rodriguez. "Know when to end the fight. Rodriguez, you've been testing me, but you've also been learning my patterns. In real combat, prolonged engagement favors whoever has backup coming. End it decisively when you have the advantage." Rodriguez nodded understanding, then launched into his most serious attack yet. He came forward with everything he had, using his size and training in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm any normal opponent. But Marcus wasn't a normal opponent. In one fluid motion, he sidestepped Rodriguez's attack, caught the drill sergeant's extended arm, and used leverage and timing to send the much larger man to the ground. Rodriguez hit hard but safely, Marcus's technique precise enough to control the impact while demonstrating complete dominance. The silence that followed was profound. Rodriguez remained on the ground for a moment, not from injury, but from the realization of how completely he'd been outmatched. When he rose, his first action was to come to attention and salute. "Sir, it's been an honor," Rodriguez said formally. "I've learned more in the last 10 minutes than in my last 6 months of training." Marcus returned the salute, feeling something shift inside himself, a recognition that the skills he'd tried to bury weren't just tools of war, but knowledge that could protect the next generation of soldiers. The circle of soldiers began to break apart, but instead of dispersing, they moved closer to Marcus. What had started as a curious crowd watching an unusual demonstration had transformed into something approaching an informal classroom, with young faces eager to learn from someone who'd proven his expertise in the most definitive way possible. "Sir," Private Jenkins approached hesitantly, the same soldier who'd barely acknowledged Marcus's existence that morning. "Could you show us that throw again? I've never seen anything like that." Before Marcus could respond, General Harrison stepped forward with the authority that instantly commanded attention. "That's enough for now, soldiers. Staff Sergeant Thompson has provided an excellent demonstration, but I need to speak with him privately." The crowd reluctantly dispersed, though Marcus could hear the excited conversations continuing as soldiers moved away. Their voices carried a new tone when discussing him, not the dismissive politeness reserved for base personnel, but the respect accorded to someone whose expertise they'd witnessed firsthand. Mrs. Chen appeared at Marcus's side, her expression a mixture of concern and bewilderment. "Marcus, honey, I had no idea. All this time you were—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the transformation she'd witnessed. "I was the same person," Marcus said gently, accepting his work shirt from her. "Just hiding parts of myself I thought were better left buried." "But why?" she asked. "Why hide something like that? You could have been training these kids instead of cleaning up after them." It was a fair question, one Marcus had asked himself countless times during sleepless nights, when the familiar weight of survivor's guilt pressed down on him. How do you explain that expertise in violence, no matter how nobly applied, comes with costs that aren't visible in after-action reports or commendation ceremonies? "Sometimes the skills that keep you alive in war aren't the ones that help you live in peace," he said finally. "I needed time to figure out who I was when the fighting stopped." General Harrison approached, having waited for the private conversation to conclude. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, I'd like to speak with you in the base commander's office. Colonel Patterson is eager to meet you, and there are some matters we need to discuss." Marcus nodded, following the general across the parade ground. He could feel eyes tracking their movement, word of the demonstration spreading through the base with the speed that characterized military communities. By evening, every soldier at Fort Braxton would know that their unassuming janitor was a decorated Special Forces veteran who'd just schooled their most intimidating drill instructor. The base commander's office was exactly what Marcus expected: polished wood, military decorations, photographs of unit formations and ceremonial events. Colonel Patterson, a lean man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who'd spent his career in leadership positions, stood as they entered. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Patterson said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you. I've been reading your file since the general called ahead. Impressive service record." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, shaking the offered hand while noting the firmness of the grip and the direct eye contact, evaluations that had become automatic during his years in command. General Harrison took a seat, gesturing for Marcus to do the same. "Staff Sergeant, I'll be direct. What we witnessed today was exceptional instruction, delivered by someone with rare expertise. The Army has invested considerable resources in your training, and frankly, we're not getting appropriate return on that investment with you in custodial services." Marcus felt his shoulders tense, the familiar anxiety rising as his carefully constructed anonymity crumbled. "Ma'am, with respect, my medical discharge was legitimate. I'm not fit for active duty." "I'm not talking about active duty," Harrison clarified. "I'm talking about utilizing your skills in a capacity that serves both your needs and the Army's. Training, consultation, tactical instruction, roles that would put your expertise to work without the operational stresses that led to your medical retirement." Colonel Patterson leaned forward in his chair. "Marcus, may I call you Marcus? We've got young soldiers deploying to combat zones with textbook knowledge but no real understanding of what they'll face. You've been there, done that, and survived to share the lessons. That's invaluable." The offer hung in the air like a door opening onto a path Marcus had thought permanently closed. For 5 years, he'd convinced himself that his military identity was something to be left behind, that the skills he'd developed had no place in civilian life. But today's demonstration had awakened something, not just muscle memory, but a sense of purpose he'd thought lost. "I'm not sure I'm ready," Marcus said honestly. "The reasons I left service, they haven't gone away just because I can still fight." General Harrison's expression softened slightly, showing the understanding that came from dealing with countless veterans struggling with similar transitions. "Marcus, nobody's asking you to go back to kicking down doors in hostile territory. We're asking you to help prepare others for what you've survived, to turn your experience into knowledge that might save lives. Think about it, Colonel Patterson added. You've spent 5 years hiding from who you were. Today, for the first time in years, you were fully yourself again. How did that feel? Marcus considered the question, remembering the clarity that had settled over him during the demonstration, the sense of purpose that had emerged when teaching young soldiers techniques that might keep them alive. For the first time in years, he'd felt like he was contributing something valuable, something that mattered. He paused, searching for words to describe the sensation of puzzle pieces clicking into place. It felt like coming home. The conversation in Colonel Patterson's office stretched into the afternoon, touching on topics Marcus hadn't discussed in years. His experiences in Afghanistan, the specific skills he'd developed, the challenges of transitioning from active combat to civilian life, subjects that had been carefully avoided in 5 years of VA appointments and therapy sessions, suddenly became the foundation for planning his future. The position would be civilian contractor, General Harrison explained, sliding a folder across the desk. Tactical instruction for deploying units, consultation on training programs, development of realistic combat scenarios. You'd maintain your current living situation, but work directly with military personnel in an advisory capacity. Marcus opened the folder, scanning documents that outlined a role perfectly tailored to his unique combination of experience and current limitations. The salary was modest but fair, the responsibilities clearly defined, and most importantly, the position acknowledged both his expertise and his need to maintain some distance from full military integration. There's no pressure timeline, Colonel Patterson added. Take the folder home, think it over. Talk to whoever you need to talk to. This offer will remain open as long as you need to consider it. As Marcus walked back toward the maintenance building to collect his equipment, he found himself moving through a transformed environment. The same hallways, the same rooms, the same people, but everything felt different now that his identity was no longer hidden. Thompson! Staff Sergeant Rodriguez appeared around a corner, his usual intimidating demeanor replaced by something approaching enthusiasm. Sir, I wanted to thank you for today's lesson. I've been teaching combat techniques for 6 years, but I learned more from you in 10 minutes than I have in recent memory. You're a good instructor, Rodriguez, Marcus replied. You've got solid fundamentals and good instincts. Today just showed you some advanced applications. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what made you volunteer today? I mean, you could have stayed invisible, kept your past private. Why step forward? It was a question Marcus had been asking himself since raising his hand in front of the assembled soldiers. Why had he broken 5 years of carefully maintained anonymity for a demonstration that served no personal purpose? I heard the disappointment in the general's voice when no one volunteered, Marcus said finally. These young soldiers, they're going to face real situations where someone needs to step up even when the odds look impossible. Maybe they needed to see that it's not about size or strength. It's about being willing to act when action is required. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Like Firebase Charlie. Marcus's expression hardened slightly at the mention of his most decorated operation. Firebase Charlie represented both his greatest military success and the event that had ultimately ended his career. 38 soldiers saved, but at a cost that included 3 members of his own team and psychological wounds that had taken years to even begin healing. Firebase Charlie was different, Marcus said quietly. That was about bringing people home. Today was about teaching people to bring themselves home. That evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment with the folder spread across his kitchen table. The official documents painted a clear picture of what his life could become: structured purpose, meaningful work, the opportunity to transform hard-won experience into knowledge that might save lives. But between the lines, he could read the challenges as well. Working directly with soldiers again would mean constant reminders of his past, daily exposure to the world he'd left behind. It would mean accepting responsibility for others' preparation and training, carrying the weight of knowing that his instruction might be the difference between life and death for young people he'd come to care about. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he recognized but hadn't seen in months. Dr. Sarah Chen, his VA therapist, and no relation to Mrs. Chen from the base. Marcus, I heard about what happened today. Dr. Chen's voice carried the professional warmth he'd come to appreciate during their sessions. Word travels fast in the veteran community. How are you processing everything? I'm not sure yet, Marcus admitted. 5 years of trying to put distance between myself and my military identity, and then in one afternoon it all comes rushing back. Tell me about how it felt, being in that situation again. Marcus considered the question carefully. Dr. Chen had spent years helping him work through the guilt and trauma associated with his military service, particularly the weight of command decisions that had cost lives even while saving others. It felt right, he said finally. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. But that scares me, because I remember how much it cost the last time I felt that way. Marcus, there's a difference between running back into the same situations that caused your trauma and finding healthy ways to apply your experience. Teaching others, sharing knowledge, that's not the same as carrying operational responsibility for life and death decisions. But what if I'm not ready? What if being around all of this triggers the same problems that forced me out? Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment before responding. What if it doesn't? What if today showed you that you've healed more than you realized? Sometimes growth means accepting new challenges, not just avoiding old triggers. After ending the call, Marcus returned to the documents spread across his table. Between the official job description and his conversation with Dr. Chen, a picture was emerging of what his life could become, not a return to his past, but an evolution that honored both his experience and his growth. The next morning brought an unusual sensation for Marcus, anticipation mixed with purpose as he prepared for work. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't simply reporting to a job. He was walking into an environment where his presence mattered in ways that extended beyond maintaining clean facilities. The change was immediately apparent as he entered the base. Soldiers who had previously walked past him without acknowledgement now offered respectful nods and genuine greetings. The transformation wasn't just in their perception of him, but in his own bearing. The slight stoop was gone, replaced by the confident posture of someone who belonged. "Morning, Staff Sergeant," Private Martinez called out, using the rank that Marcus hadn't heard applied to himself in half a decade. The title felt strange, but not unwelcome, like putting on an old uniform that still fit despite the years. Mrs. Chen was waiting for him at the maintenance office, her expression mixing pride with concern. "Marcus, honey, everyone's talking about yesterday. Are you doing okay with all the attention?" "I'm adjusting," Marcus replied, collecting his cleaning supplies with the automatic motions of long habit. "It's going to take some time to figure out what comes next." "Colonel Patterson called this morning," she said, handing him a message slip. "He wants to see you at 1,000 hours. Something about a training session this afternoon." Marcus looked at the note, recognizing the shift that was already beginning. His cleaning duties would continue for now, but clearly other responsibilities were being layered on top. The transition from invisible janitor to valued instructor wouldn't happen overnight, but it was beginning. The morning passed quickly, with Marcus finding himself interrupted frequently by soldiers seeking advice or simply wanting to express their appreciation for the previous day's demonstration. Each interaction reinforced the growing realization that his expertise was genuinely needed, that his experience could make a meaningful difference in these young people's preparation for the challenges they might face. At precisely 1,000 hours, Marcus presented himself at Colonel Patterson's office, noting that his punctuality and military bearing were returning automatically after years of casual civilian scheduling. "Marcus, come in," Patterson said, gesturing to a chair. "I hope you've had time to consider our offer. But regardless of your decision on the contractor position, I have a request for this afternoon." "Sir, we've got a platoon of infantry soldiers deploying to Afghanistan in 6 weeks. They've completed all their required training, but after yesterday's demonstration, I think they could benefit from some real-world perspective. Would you be willing to spend a few hours with them? Share some practical insights that might complement their textbook knowledge?" Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These weren't abstract training exercises or theoretical discussions. These were young people who would soon face the same dangers that had shaped and scarred him. What he shared with them might determine whether they came home safely. "Of course, sir. What specific areas would you like me to focus on?" "Situational awareness, decision-making under pressure, adapting to unexpected circumstances, the kind of practical knowledge that turns training into survival skills." The afternoon training session took place in the base's tactical classroom. a space designed to simulate various combat scenarios. 24 soldiers sat in folding chairs, their expressions mixing curiosity with skepticism as Marcus entered wearing his maintenance uniform rather than military dress. "I know what you're thinking," Marcus began without preamble. "You've completed months of intensive training, learned from experienced instructors, studied tactics and procedures until you could recite them in your sleep. So why are you listening to a janitor?" A few soldiers shifted uncomfortably, but most remained attentively focused. "The answer is that everything you've learned so far is absolutely correct, under ideal conditions. Real combat doesn't provide ideal conditions. Real combat is chaos, confusion, and split-second decisions based on incomplete information. That's what I'm here to talk about." Marcus moved to the front of the room, his demeanor shifting into the authoritative presence of someone who had commanded soldiers in life-or-death situations. The maintenance uniform no longer seemed incongruous. It had become simply clothing worn by someone whose expertise transcended appearance. "How many of you have been in a real firefight?" Marcus asked. No hands went up, as expected. "How many of you think you know what it's like based on your training?" Most hands rose, then slowly lowered as soldiers began to understand the distinction he was drawing. Training teaches you what to do. Experience teaches you what can go wrong and how to adapt when it does. Marcus pulled up a chair, sitting forward with the intensity of someone sharing life-saving information. "Let me tell you about Firebase Charlie, and what it taught me about the difference between knowing what to do and being able to do it when everything goes wrong." For the next 2 hours, Marcus shared stories and insights that no training manual could provide. He talked about the fog of war, about making decisions with insufficient information, about maintaining morale when situations seemed hopeless. But more importantly, he talked about the psychological challenges of combat, the fear, the doubt, the responsibility for others' lives that could paralyze decision-making when decisiveness was most crucial. "The most important thing I can tell you," Marcus concluded, "is that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is being afraid and doing your job anyway. Every one of you will be scared when the shooting starts. That's normal, human, and expected. Don't let the fear convince you that you're not ready, because fear is part of being ready." As the session ended, soldiers approached with questions that went beyond tactical procedures to the heart of what they were preparing to face. Marcus found himself providing not just technical instruction, but psychological preparation, helping these young people understand that their concerns and fears were normal parts of preparing for extraordinary circumstances. Staff Sergeant Williams, a squad leader preparing for his second deployment, approached after most soldiers had left. "What you said about Firebase Charlie, about not leaving people behind, how do you live with that kind of responsibility?" Marcus considered the question carefully, recognizing it as something he'd struggled with throughout his career and retirement. "You live with it by accepting that you can't control every outcome, only your own actions. You do your best with the information you have, you never give up, and you trust your training and your team. Sometimes that's enough and sometimes it isn't, but the alternative, not trying, not accepting the responsibility, isn't really an alternative at all." Walking home that evening, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted during the day's activities. The question was no longer whether he was ready to take on new responsibilities, but whether he was ready to deny these soldiers the benefit of his experience. The decision had effectively made itself. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus signed the contractor agreement, and Fort Braxton had transformed around him in ways both subtle and profound. His maintenance duties had been reassigned to other personnel, replaced by a schedule that included tactical instruction, consultation on training protocols, and individual mentoring sessions with soldiers preparing for deployment. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Marcus moved through the base with the confident bearing of someone who had found his place again, his step firm and purposeful. The ghosts that had haunted him for 5 years hadn't disappeared, but they no longer controlled his daily existence. Instead, they had become sources of wisdom, hard-won lessons that could benefit others facing similar challenges. "Thompson, you've got a visitor," Colonel Patterson called out as Marcus finished reviewing training scenarios in the tactical planning room. "Someone I think you'll want to see." Marcus looked up from his work to see a familiar figure in the doorway, Captain James Morrison, formerly Lieutenant Morrison, one of the soldiers Marcus had extracted from Firebase Charlie 3 years earlier. The young officer had filled out since their last meeting, carrying himself with the confidence that came from surviving combat and growing into leadership. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Morrison said formally, then broke into a grin and extended his hand. "Or should I say, Mr. Thompson now? I heard about your new position here." "Marcus is fine," Marcus replied, shaking hands with genuine warmth. "It's good to see you, James. You look well." "I am well, thanks to you. All of us from Firebase Charlie are." Morrison's expression grew more serious. "That's actually why I'm here. I've been assigned to the 82nd Airborne, and we're deploying to Afghanistan in 2 months. When I heard you were providing pre-deployment training, I requested permission to bring my platoon here for a session." Marcus felt the familiar mix of pride and responsibility that came with knowing his actions had lasting consequences. Morrison was living proof that the risks taken at Firebase Charlie had been worthwhile, that the cost in lives and psychological trauma had produced tangible results in the form of soldiers who went on to serve and lead others. "I'd be honored to work with your platoon," Marcus said. "What specific areas do you want to focus on?" "Everything," Morrison replied without hesitation. "These soldiers are good, but they're untested. I want them to hear from someone who's been where they're going, someone who understands what they'll face. I want them to learn from the same person who taught me how to bring people home." The training session with Morrison's platoon was scheduled for the following week, but word of the special session spread quickly through the base. By the time Marcus arrived at the designated training area, he found not just Morrison's soldiers, but representatives from several other units, including some who had attended his earlier sessions and wanted to observe his methods. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was also present, having requested permission to audit the session as part of his own professional development. The intimidating drill instructor, who had once seemed like Marcus's opposite, had become something of a protégé, eager to learn advanced techniques that he could incorporate into his own training programs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison addressed the assembled soldiers, "today you're going to receive instruction from someone who exemplifies the warrior ethos that defines our profession. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson led the rescue operation at Firebase Charlie, but more importantly for you, he spent the last month developing training protocols that are already making our soldiers more effective in combat situations." Marcus stepped forward, no longer feeling the anxiety that had once accompanied public speaking. The soldiers before him represented the next generation of warriors, young people who would face the same challenges he had confronted and possibly overcome them with greater success because of lessons learned from his experience. "Before we begin," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the assembled group, "I want you to understand something important. Everything I'm going to share with you was learned at considerable cost, not just to me, but to soldiers who didn't make it home. This isn't theoretical knowledge. It's paid for in blood and measured in lives saved. Treat it accordingly." The next 4 hours constituted the most comprehensive combat instruction Marcus had ever delivered. He covered everything from basic situational awareness to complex decision-making under pressure, from individual survival techniques to small unit leadership in crisis situations. But more than tactics and procedures, he conveyed the mindset that separated survivors from casualties, the mental toughness, adaptability, and refusal to surrender that characterized successful warriors. "The most important lesson from Firebase Charlie," Marcus concluded, "isn't about the tactical decisions we made or the equipment we used. It's about the commitment to never leave anyone behind, no matter how difficult the circumstances become. That commitment to your mission, to your soldiers, to your principles, is what will define you when everything else falls apart." As the formal session ended, Morrison approached with several of his squad leaders, all of them carrying notebooks filled with observations and insights they'd gathered during the presentation. "Sir," Sergeant First Class Davis, one of Morrison's most experienced NCOs, addressed Marcus. "That scenario you described, the one where you had to choose between following orders and protecting civilians. How do you prepare soldiers for those kinds of moral decisions?" It was exactly the kind of question Marcus had hoped to hear, evidence that these soldiers were thinking beyond technical procedures to the ethical complexities that defined real-world combat. These weren't just tactical challenges. They were the kinds of impossible decisions that could define a soldier's entire career and personal identity. "You prepare by establishing your principles before you face the crisis," Marcus replied. "You decide what you stand for, what you're willing to die for, and what you refuse to compromise on. Then, when the situation demands immediate action, you don't have to debate ethics under fire. You already know who you are and what you'll do. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same spot where he had first volunteered to face Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, but everything had changed. The assembly area was filled not with curious observers, but with graduates of his training programs. Soldiers who had deployed, faced combat, and returned with stories of how his instruction had saved their lives and the lives of their teammates. General Harrison was present again, this time not to seek volunteers but to present Marcus with the Army Civilian Service Award, recognition for exceptional contributions to military readiness and soldier welfare. The ceremony was modest by military standards, but the significance was profound. Official acknowledgement that his transition from invisible janitor to valued instructor represented success not just for him personally, but for the institution that had found a way to harness his expertise productively. Ladies and gentlemen, General Harrison addressed the assembled soldiers, we gather today to recognize someone who embodies the principle that service doesn't end with retirement. Marcus Thompson's journey from decorated Special Forces operator to civilian contractor represents the kind of adaptive leadership our military needs in the 21st century. Marcus accepted the award with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his transformation, understanding that the real recognition came not from official ceremonies, but from the letters he received from deployed soldiers, the reports of successful missions, and the knowledge that his experience was being translated into practical knowledge for the next generation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now a close colleague and friend, stepped forward to present Marcus with an unofficial gift from the Drill Instructors Association, a small bronze plaque reading "Warrior Teacher," recognition from the professional educators who had watched him develop into one of the most effective instructors on the base. "Sir," Rodriguez said formally, "you taught us that the best warriors aren't necessarily the ones who win fights, but the ones who prepare others to avoid unnecessary fights and win the ones that can't be avoided." Captain Morrison, recently returned from his Afghanistan deployment, was also present, along with several members of his platoon. Their presence represented the ultimate validation of Marcus's new role. Soldiers who had applied his instruction in real combat situations and lived to describe its effectiveness. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison addressed the gathering, "6 months ago, you taught my platoon about decision-making under pressure. Last month, that instruction helped us navigate an IED attack that could have resulted in multiple casualties. Instead, everyone came home safely. That's the real measure of effective instruction. Not what happens in the classroom, but what happens when the classroom lessons meet real-world challenges." As the ceremony concluded and soldiers dispersed, Marcus found himself in conversation with Mrs. Chen, who had attended to see the recognition of someone she had watched transform from a hidden, struggling veteran into a confident professional making meaningful contributions to military readiness. "Marcus, honey, I'm so proud of you," she said with motherly affection. "But I have to ask, do you ever miss the quiet life, the anonymity?" Marcus considered her question, looking around the base that had become his professional home again, watching soldiers who sought his advice and expertise, feeling the satisfaction that came from meaningful work that aligned with his deepest values and hardest-won experience. "Sometimes," he admitted, "there was a simplicity to being invisible that had its own appeal, but I think I was hiding from myself as much as from others. This feels like coming home to who I was always supposed to be." "And what's that?" "Someone who serves," Marcus replied without hesitation. "The methods change, the uniform changes, even the battlefield changes, but the core mission remains the same, preparing others to face whatever challenges they encounter, helping them develop the skills and mindset they need to overcome impossible odds and bring everyone home safely." As the sun set over Fort Braxton, Marcus walked across the parade ground where his transformation had begun, with a simple decision to volunteer when no one else would step forward. The maintenance cart was gone, replaced by tactical manuals and training schedules, but the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. Sometimes the most important battles are won not by the strongest or fastest, but by those willing to act when action is required, regardless of the personal cost or public recognition. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen, his VA therapist. "Saw the news coverage of your award ceremony. How does it feel to be a war hero twice?" Marcus smiled, understanding that the question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what constituted heroism. The real heroes were the young soldiers who would deploy tomorrow, who would face unknown dangers with nothing but their training, their teammates, and the knowledge that someone who had walked that path before them cared enough to prepare them as thoroughly as possible. He typed back, "Not a war hero. Just a teacher who happens to know some useful things. The heroes are the ones still fighting." As he reached his car, Marcus looked back at the base one more time, seeing it not as the place where he had hidden from his past, but as the place where he had learned to transform that past into something valuable for the future. The nightmares still came occasionally. The weight of command decisions still pressed on his consciousness during quiet moments, but they no longer defined his existence. Instead, they had become tools, difficult lessons learned at considerable cost, now shared with others who might benefit from that hard-won wisdom. The invisible janitor was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true service meant using every experience, including the painful ones, to prepare others for the challenges they would inevitably face. In the distance, he could hear Rodriguez calling cadence as a new group of recruits marched across the parade ground, their voices strong and confident as they prepared for whatever lay ahead. Tomorrow, Marcus would begin working with some of those same soldiers, sharing the knowledge that had been paid for in blood and earned through survival. It was exactly where he belonged.